Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira, on Rajya Sabha television. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have happened around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. Washington announces indefinite extension to American role in Afghanistan. Withdrawal of forces halted. Nearly 10,000 US troops to stay on in view of continuing Taliban insurgency. Dutch Safety Board report says Russia-made Buk missile system was used to shoot down Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, killing all 298 on board. Tensions mount over China's island reclamations in the South China Sea. US rubbishes China's claim, says it will go where it wants. China warns against escalating military tensions. And a week after dual blasts ripped through a peace rally in Ankara, Turkish investigators say the Islamic State was the likely culprit amid internal political unrest. Fears of rising IS presence in Turkey. Our top story on the show this week. The US has confirmed plans to extend its military presence in Afghanistan beyond 2016. The move putting off the withdrawal comes as a major shift in policy in the backdrop of the Taliban's attack on Kunduz and assessments of more US troops being needed to counter a growing Taliban threat. Afghan President Hamid Karzai had asked US President Barack Obama to think on the lines of an extension during his visit in January. On Thursday, Obama said that the US would keep 5,500 troops in the country when he leaves office in 2017. Originally, all but a small embassy-based force were due to leave by the end of next year. There are currently 9,800 US troops stationed in Afghanistan. The US forces will be stationed in 4 locations: Kabul, Bagram, Jalalabad and Kandahar. With the end of the US combat mission in the end of 2014, Afghan forces faced their first fighting season on their own this summer.
The bottom line is, in key areas of the country, the security situation is still very fragile. And in some places, there's risk of deterioration. Fortunately, in President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, there is a national unity government that supports a strong partnership with the United States. During their visit earlier this year, President Ghani and I agreed to continue our counterterrorism cooperation. And he has asked for continued support as Afghan forces grow stronger.
And joining me for a chat this week to talk about this is Rezaul Hasan, who is part of the Hindustan Times. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and welcome to Rajya Sabha television. You know, as far as the US deciding to keep troops back in Afghanistan, what do you think has prompted President Obama to do this?
Well, you know, I mean, if you really looked at the situation over the past couple of years, especially after President Obama had announced the drawdown, it had seemed almost inevitable that, you know, the US would at some point in time have to consider a prolonged role. And I think Kunduz was really the clincher. I mean, what happened in Kunduz, we saw that, you know, the Afghan troops who have been trained by the US and other Western nations have been doing a commendable job, but they are still a very, you know, a green force. I mean, they have been tested in combat, but they are yet to prove that, you know, they can take on the Taliban on their own. I think that must have been the reason which, you know, the US has done this U-turn now and said that their troops are going to stay on for a little longer. I think it's in nobody's interest to have you know, an Afghanistan that is not stable. It's not good for the entire neighborhood. It's not good for the US. And I would assume that, you know, these reports of the IS also now making inroads into Afghanistan, in fact, the IS putting itself up against the Taliban as another force in Afghanistan could have possibly played on the minds of US decision makers.
Indeed. You know, but how do you think that this is going to pan out back in the US? Because, you know, the general public or the citizens of the US have been demanding that, you know, the troops be brought back to the US and they do not want, you know, continuation of forces fighting in countries other than their own. So how do you think it's going to affect the sentiment back home?
Well, it's a catch-22 situation, right? I mean, the US wants to have a big role on the world stage. They want to take care of insurgencies, but at the same time, you know, they don't want their troops getting in harm's way. I think we have seen some sort of the new, way of doing things in Syria. I mean, where they haven't really committed ground troops, but they have taken action. But I mean, I don't think it's going to be a popular decision. But then President Obama is not a person who is going to run for office again. So, I mean, it really doesn't matter to him. So, I don't think it's going to go down very well with the American public. But at the same time, I guess, they had to look at what President Ghani was saying, what the situation demanded. So, I think, but again, these are not the numbers that we've seen in the past. It's just about 10,000 troops. And again, they are not in active combat operations as they were in the past. So the Afghans are going to take the lead role in security, but we are going to see the US hanging on for some more time.
Yeah, but this kind of an arrangement, we've seen it, like go really bad in Iraq. It's happened in Iraq. It's happening now in Afghanistan. We're seeing signs of it. We've seen it in Kunduz. So do you believe that somewhere down the line that, the Taliban is going to come back? We're going to see a resurgent Taliban taking over maybe?
Well, I mean, I think the US itself sees some sort of a role for the Taliban. Otherwise, the US wouldn't have sent observers for the talks between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban that were held in Pakistan and other venues. I mean, we've had these reports. Both the Chinese and the US have had observers.
Yes.
So it's very clear that the US at some stage is looking at some sort of a role for the Afghan Taliban. I mean, they're kind of now amenable to that. Obviously, what sort of role the Taliban are going to have, that's still up in the air. So I think the US is kind of veering around to the idea that at some stage the Taliban are going to become part of, some sort of a dispensation in Kabul. Whether that's good or bad, I mean, that remains to be seen, because we haven't seen any change in the Taliban's attitude.
Indeed, but back home in India, do you think it's going to have any kind of a bearing, what's happening in Afghanistan?
Well, it's definitely going to have, an impact on the people who make the Afghan policy, the India's policy for Afghanistan. Pakistan doesn't want us to have any sort of role in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And thanks to the backing of people like China, we have the Pakistani establishment playing a role in the talks between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. In fact, they want a bigger role for themselves. So it's obviously something that's going to worry us. At the same time, I don't see India in any way backing out of Afghanistan. I mean, we have too much of a stake there. We are possibly thinking of, having economic ties with Iran via Afghanistan. We have just built a new building for the Afghan parliament. So it's clear we have stakes. Indian companies have invested in infrastructure. We have pumped in money in various sectors. So I think we are going to have to balance this out. And we are going to have this constant thing going with Pakistan, where the Pakistanis are going to accuse us of having some sort of a subversive role over there. But I mean, that is all, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, all we want is a stable neighborhood.
Indeed.
And that's the larger picture that people like Prime Minister Modi and the National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, project for India.
Indeed. All right. We'll have to leave it at that. Rezaul, Hasan, thank you so much for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Well, on that note, we'll slip into a short break. Still to come, a big step forward towards actual implementations of the Iran nuclear deal. It's been cleared by the Iran Parliament and its Guardians Council. That and lots more still to come. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, a Russia-made BUK-fired missile brought down flight MH17 over East Ukraine in July last year. That's the central finding of the Dutch Safety Board in its final report. That also brought to light several other mysteries around the disaster that killed all 298 people on board. In keeping within its powers and mandate, the board did not, however, specify who launched the missile. The report gives out some horrific details.
The ghostly frame put together from pieces of the ill-fated aircraft. It was under this ugly shadow that the Dutch Safety Board released its findings. A report on a year-long study around the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that killed all 298 people on board.
Reconstruction demonstrates the effects of the impact and shows the marks where the cockpit was torn from the rest of the fuselage. The high-energy objects that perforated the aeroplane were also found in the bodies of 3 crew members seated in the cockpit. The preformed fragments have distinctive shapes.
The report says a blast from a missile warhead ejected hundreds of pieces of shrapnel into the plane with tremendous force.
Flight MH17 crashed as a result of the detonation of a warhead outside the aeroplane, above the left-hand side of the cockpit. This warhead was of the 9N314M type, carried on the kind of missile that is installed on the Buk surface-to-air missile system.
Justra said flight MH17 was cruising at 33,000 feet on a routine flight path to Asia when it was hit by the warhead. Investigations focused on what happened during those last moments. Some 120 objects, mostly metal fragments, were found in the body of the first officer in the cockpit. The 3 officers in the cockpit died instantly, the passengers seconds later as the plane disintegrated. The aircraft likely flew further about 5 miles and hit the ground about a minute and a half later. Pieces of the aircraft were found strewn over 50 square kilometers in East Ukraine. In the aftermath, families had to wait for an unnecessarily long time for confirmation of the crash. The report also says parts of the plane that showed major damage from the Buk missile were removed from the crash site, not ruling out a cover-up operation. The missile was fired by a Buk surface-to-air missile system, the kind only Russia has in its armory. But the report stops short of actually pointing fingers at who did it. It stays silent on the exact location from where the firing happened. The Dutch Safety Board comes down hard on keeping airspace over the Ukrainian conflict zone open, despite several aircraft having been shot down in the area.
States that are involved in an armed conflict should put more effort into promoting the safety of their airspace. Other states, operators and international organizations will have to improve their risk analysis. Moreover, operators should be more transparent about the flight routes they choose. This will require changes to the international aviation regulations.
A Ukraine-Russia war of words had taken off even before the report was released. Russia termed it false, illogical and fabricated, saying the missile was fired by a Ukrainian launcher. The Ukrainian president claimed pinpointing of the Buk launch system as good as pinned blame on Russia. Investigators point out various dimensions that still need further probing.
We already have quite a bit of persons of interest in which we are gathering information and evidence. But still, and we have a lot of bricks, but we still need a lot of cement between those bricks. So there's still quite some work to do, and it's not that we are now at the point that, well, within a week or 2 weeks, arrest can be made. We are not that far yet.
For the victims' families, the report does go some way to finding closure.
A little bit, because it looks as though that we found out like 298 people didn't suffer. They're not 100% certain, but because of the impact of the missile, the explosion, the confusion and everything else, it sounds as though everybody died peacefully. And that's comfort to me, and I would think all the other families on flight MH17.
The downing of MH17, mistaken though it might have been, has come out as among the most tragic fallouts of human conflict. Beyond the punishment, this report somewhere calls for lessons to be learned. But will they be? Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Let's take a look now at some other events that made headlines across the globe this week in our segment Globe Watch.
President Pranab Mukherjee concluded a 6-day trip to Jordan, Palestine and Israel, the first Indian presidential visit to Palestine and Israel. He said the focus of his visit was an effort at promoting the message peaceful coexistence between the arch-rivals. According to Mukherjee, in his talks with both the Palestinian and Israeli side, he felt that there was a desire to resolve their dispute peacefully. The president also said that India would not find it problematic to balance Israel-Palestine relations, pointing out that while India had been among the first countries to recognize Israel, it had continued its ties with Palestine. Iran's nuclear accord with world powers has won final approval in the Islamic Republic, with the top panel of jurists and clerics, the Guardians Council, giving it the green light. A day earlier, the Iranian parliament had endorsed the deal that curbs Iran's atomic program in exchange for an end to sanctions. The vote came after fierce debate over the terms of the 14 July Accord, which has faced a rough ride from hardliners in Tehran. Iranian officials have said sanctions should be lifted by the end of the year or January at the latest. The Myanmar government and 8 ethnic armed groups signed the nationwide ceasefire accord in Naypyidaw, signaling the near end of more than 6 decades of civil conflict. The deal ends conflicts with multiple ethnic factions demanding autonomy in northern, resource-rich areas of the country. Leaders of the 8 armed group, besides President Thein Sein and senior army Myanmar officials and witnesses from several countries, were present at the signing ceremony. However, peace hopes remain partial as 7 of the 15 rebel groups refused to sign the agreement, which the Myanmar government wanted to clinch to boost its popularity ahead of next month's election.
Moving on now, tensions brew afresh in the South China Sea as the US says it would obey only international law on limitations to its military operations, and China hitting back with claims of indisputable sovereignty over certain islands and their surrounding waters. Allegations of China using the islands for military activity has raised hackles among neighbours, with fears of a confrontation escalating to dangerous levels. Here's more.
Now make no mistake, the United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, as we do around the world, and the South China Sea is not and will not be an exception.
Carter spoke after a 2-day high-level US-Australia meet in which the long-time allies expressed strong concern over Beijing's building on disputed islands of the South China Sea. Besides this meet, the US has been holding joint naval exercises with the Philippines and other nations in the region. Reports suggest the US has already decided to conduct freedom of navigation operations inside 12 nautical mile limits that China claims are on islands in the Spratly archipelago.
It's not just Australia and the United States who's concerned about the South China Sea. It's a regional issue. Indeed, it should be a global concern. The United Kingdom, Europeans, others have an interest in a stable, peaceful South China Sea.
The centre of tensions lies here, several islands in the South China Seas, where China is carrying out what it calls constructions and reclamation to improve living conditions of its personnel working there and for disaster prevention needs. But the US reads this as threatening freedom of navigation and security in the Asia-Pacific, reacting sharply on Chinese reconnaissance of its missions to the area. China has constructed lighthouses, reclaimed land, and even says it is within its power to construct an air defense identification zone on islands in the South China Sea. If foreign powers continue a military build-up in the area, it lashed out at the US, blaming it of muscle flexing and deliberately seeking conflict.
I want to stress that China has always respected and protected all countries' maritime and flight navigational rights according to national law. But we will never allow any country to violate China's territorial waters and airspace in the Spratly Islands in the name of protecting freedom of navigation and overflight. We urge the related parties not to take any provocative actions and genuinely take a responsible stance on regional peace and stability.
Strategic analysts say tensions could escalate if the US goes ahead with its South China Sea patrol plans, moving the Chinese towards tightening military defenses, which could even lead to military warnings and tailing of US aircrafts. Once again, hopes of greater diplomacy arise to find a way out of the impasse. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Moving on now, ripples from the terror attack in Turkey's capital Ankara last Saturday threatened to draw the country further into the fight against the Islamic State, besides the internal political tumult ahead of elections due next month. More immediately, the blast followed by 3 days of mourning meant that ghastly and tragic terror sequence repeating itself. Here's a report.
In Turkish capital Ankara this time, it was a peaceful gathering of pro-Kurdish activists and civic groups raising a call for peace. Then this. Two bombs struck seconds apart, the deadliest single attack Turkey has ever seen. That gory dance of death repeats itself, splattered blood and mangled bodies, ambulances and emergency operations, and a death toll already above 100, dozens injured. The shock, the grief writ large, an outpouring of sympathy from a nation relatively new to terror. This attack was a direct echo of similar blasts at Suruç near the Turkey-Syria border in July. They too were on Kurdish rallies. No claims of responsibility then too. Opposition groups claim there was no proper probe either. Turkey is vulnerable to infiltration by the Islamic State, which holds swaths of Syrian land abutting the country. The probe, DNA tests, modus operandi of the blasts, the nature of the device and explosive point at Islamic State, primary suspect.
These three terrorist organizations are seen as potential suspects for this attack. But when we looked at how the attack happened and the general tendency of the events, Daesh has become the primary suspect.
Apart from the IS terror phase, suspicion also points to the Kurdistan Workers' Party PKK that is active in the southeast, another signal of peace talks with them dying down. There's also a strong Turkish internal politics aspect at work, and it reflected in protests and demonstrations around the country in the last week. Riot police with water cannons and armored vehicles took on protesters waving banners, people accusing the Erdogan government of murder, of neglecting security, of messing up foreign policy, stressing his government would pay in elections due next month. Opposition groups, labor unions, students, professionals and more led demonstrations.
Canlı bomba bir Orta Doğu geleneğidir dedi.
Suicide bombing is a Middle Eastern style of attack. The foreign policy that the government adopted has brought terror into our country and we have to get rid of this doom. Turkey needs to get away from the Middle Eastern swamp. This country doesn't deserve pain and tears. Why should our country suffer from every drama of the Middle East?
The latest attack has a wider, more disturbing dimension. Fears of the IS stepping up its war into the Turkish heartland as reprisal for Turkey's support to the US-led coalition. Fears of being drawn deeper into the conflict, not just with the IS in the neighborhood, but also with Kurdish groups within. Fears of darker days ahead. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, let's shift focus now and bring you up to speed with some big events from sporting arenas around the world this week in our segment Sports Action. The Netherlands' bid to qualify for Euro 2016 ended in failure as Robin van Persie scored an own goal in a home defeat by the 10-man Czech Republic. The Dutch needed to win and needed Iceland to beat Turkey to earn a playoff spot, but Van Persie's error saw them go 3 down despite Mark Suchy seeing red. Klaas-Jan Huntelaar and Van Persie replied to goals from Pavel Kederabek and Josef Sural, but instead it was Turkey who secured third place. Fatih Terim's side beat Iceland 1-0. Chelsea manager Jose Mourinho says his Football Association fine is a disgrace after being ordered to pay £50,000. Mourinho had claimed officials were afraid to award his team penalties after Robert Madley denied the Blues a spot kick in a 3-1 loss to Southampton. It was announced on Wednesday that the 52-year-old had also been given a suspended one-match stadium ban. Olympic and Paralympic athlete Oscar Pistorius, jailed for killing his girlfriend, is to be freed from prison to house arrest on Tuesday. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2014 after being found guilty of culpable homicide or manslaughter. He shot Riva Steenkamp through a locked bathroom door but said that he thought she was an intruder. The prosecution has appealed, saying he should instead be convicted of murder. That case is expected to be heard on 3rd November. Canadian tennis player Eugenie Bouchard has filed a case against the United States Tennis Association for their negligence, due to which she suffered a concussion in a locker room. The incident eventually forced her to withdraw from the season's final Grand Slam tournament. Bouchard revealed that she slipped because of a slippery and dangerous substance in a locker room. Bouchard was also ruled out of the Tokyo, China and Wuhan tournament because she failed to recover from the injury. Ex-NBA basketball player Lamar Odom is being treated in hospital after he was found unconscious at a brothel in Nevada. Police were called to Love Ranch brothel in Crystal, Nevada after he was found unresponsive on Tuesday. The American had to be driven to hospital because he was too tall to be airlifted in a helicopter. 35-year-old Odom has played basketball for Miami, Dallas and the Los Angeles Lakers and Clippers. He also played for the US in the 2004 Athens Olympics, winning the bronze medal. And finally, let's take you across to a hot air balloon festival in New Mexico that has risen to become the biggest in the world. The Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta has several hundred of these wonders from 22 countries floating out each day, and more than 22,000 spectators each day as well. Enjoy this as I take your leave. Until next time, this is Frank Pereira signing off.